At some point in 2022, about £94 was added to your household energy bill. Not for energy. Not for the gas that heated your house or the electricity that ran your fridge. That £94 was to cover the cost of energy companies going out of business. Companies most people had never heard of. Companies you had almost certainly never been a customer of. And if you had deliberately stayed with a large, boring, established supplier, precisely because you did not want to take a risk on a cheap newcomer, you paid it anyway. Every household did. Here is the scale of what that money was cleaning up. Between 2021 and 2022, 29 British energy suppliers went out of business. Around 2.4 million households had to be transferred to new suppliers, typically landing on more expensive tariffs. Citizens' Advice put the difference at around £30 a month for the remainder of their contract. The cost of handling those transfers and buying the energy those customers needed came to roughly £2.7 billion, which went on to everyone's bills. On top of that, taxpayers faced a separate bill estimated at around £1.9 billion. Together, about £4.6 billion. Now, the standard explanation for all of this is a gas price shock. Wholesale prices went through the roof, energy suppliers were caught out, businesses failed. Bad luck, terrible timing, nobody's fault exactly. That explanation is true, and it is not enough, and the gap is where this film lives. Because wholesale prices rose for everybody. Every supplier in Britain faced the same wholesale market on the same days. Some of them survived it. 29 did not. Something distinguished those two groups, and it was not luck. So let me tell you where we're going. First, what an energy supplier actually is, because most people picture it wrongly and the misunderstanding matters. Then what those 29 companies were and were not required to have. Then why the cost of their failure landed where it did. And finally what the whole episode says about the word competition, which is doing more work in this story than any other. Let's start with what an energy supplier does. Most people imagine a company that produces energy. It doesn't. Your supplier does not own the power station, does not own the gas field, does not own the pipes under your street or the cables overhead. Those are all somebody else's. What your supplier does is buy energy on the wholesale market and sell it to you at a retail price. That's it. It is a trading business, wearing a utilities clothes. And a trading business has one central risk. You are committed to selling at one price while buying at a price that moves. When you sign a fixed tariff, your supplier has promised to sell you energy at a set rate for a year or two. But it has not yet bought that energy. It will buy it over the coming months, at whatever the market charges then. If wholesale prices rise sharply, the supplier is now selling at yesterday's price and buying at today's. Every unit it delivers loses money. And it cannot stop, because it has customers under contract and a legal obligation to keep supplying them. There is a standard way to manage that, and it is called hedging. You buy the energy in advance, at the same time you sell the tariff, locking in your margin. Prices can then do whatever they like and you are unaffected, because you already own what you promised to deliver. Here is the thing about hedging. It costs money up front. Buying a year of gas in advance means having the cash to buy a year of gas in advance. It ties up capital, it reduces flexibility, and if prices happen to fall you look foolish compared to a competitor who didn't bother. So hedging is expensive insurance. A well-capitalized company buys it. A company with no capital cannot. And that brings us to what those 29 companies actually were. The National Audit Office examined this and its findings are remarkable. It said the regulator had operated what it termed a low-bar approach to licensing new suppliers. It did not undertake detailed scrutiny of applicants' financial position when they applied for a license, nor after they entered the market. Read that carefully. To become a company legally entitled to bill millions of households for an essential service, you did not have to demonstrate that you could survive an adverse market. The consequences were exactly what you would expect. The Audit Office found suppliers being set up by people without knowledge of the industry, and without investing their own money. One firm was effectively set up by a graduate in his bedroom, on a laptop. That is not an insult aimed at the graduate. It is a description of a regulatory system that permitted it. Now, why would a regulator do that? And this is important, because the easy answer is incompetence, and I don't think that's right. It was policy. For years, British energy was dominated by 6 large suppliers, and the political and regulatory consensus was that this was bad for consumers. Prices were high, service was poor, and switching was rare. The remedy everybody agreed on was competition. More suppliers, more choice, more pressure on the incumbents. And if you want new entrants in a capital-intensive industry, the surest way to get them is to lower the amount of capital required to enter. The low bar was not an oversight. It was the mechanism. It also worked, in its own terms. Dozens of new suppliers appeared. Prices came under pressure. Switching rates rose. For several years, this looked like a policy success, and it was reported as one. But look at what kind of company that policy selects for. If entering the market requires almost no capital, then the companies that enter are companies with almost no capital. If you have no capital, you cannot hedge. If you cannot hedge, you cannot survive a price rise. And if you are competing against hedged incumbents, you can undercut them easily, because you are not paying for the insurance they are paying for. So the unhedged supplier offers the cheapest tariff on the comparison site. It wins customers. It looks like the disruptive newcomer the whole policy was designed to encourage. It is also, structurally, a company that will fail if prices rise. Not might. Will. And there's one more piece, which is where this connects to something I've talked about before. How does a supplier with no capital fund its operations at all? Largely from you. Customers pay by monthly direct debit, and those payments are level across the year, the same amount in July as in January. But you use far more energy in winter. So through the summer, you are paying for gas you have not used yet, and your supplier is holding that money. That is a credit balance, and across a customer base it is an enormous pool of cash. It is, in effect, an interest-free loan from customers to their supplier. If you watch the film I made about the poverty premium, that mechanism will be familiar. Paying in advance is normally rewarded with a lower price, because the customer is lending the company working capital. The same thing is happening here. The difference is what the working capital was funding. The Audit Office found that in many cases, customer credit balances had disappeared by the time the company failed. Money customers had paid in advance, gone. And it noted that many executives had taken millions of pounds out in pay, fees, and loans before their firms went bust. So here's where the whole thing turns over. The instinctive reading of this story is that 29 badly run companies were caught out by a market shock. Some were reckless, some were unlucky, and the collapse was a failure of business judgment. I don't think that's the right frame, because it treats the failures as a departure from how the system was meant to work. Look at it structurally instead. A company with no capital has no capacity to absorb a loss. That is what capital is for. It is the buffer between an adverse event and the people the company owes things to. Remove the buffer, and the loss does not vanish. It cannot. Energy was delivered to 2.4 million households and somebody paid the wholesale price for it. If the supplier has nothing, the loss simply travels onward, automatically, to whoever is next in the chain. Which means these companies were not businesses that failed to survive a shock. They were structures that could not, by construction, absorb one. The shock exposed that, it didn't create it. And here is the part that ought to be uncomfortable. When you allow a company to trade with no capital, you have not removed the risk. You have moved it, silently, onto whoever will end up paying when it fails. In this case, that is precisely who it was. The mechanism is called the supplier of last resort. When a supplier collapses, the regulator appoints another company to take on its customers, which protects those households and, importantly, restores their lost credit balances. The rescuing supplier then reclaims those costs through a levy. And the levy is spread across every bill payer in Britain. The claims came to around £2.35 billion, and the total cost to bill payers has been put at roughly £2.7 billion. About £94 per household. So the person who never switched, who stayed with a large established supplier at a slightly higher price precisely because they wanted no part of a cheap newcomer, funded the failure of the cheap newcomers. Their caution bought them nothing. The risk they declined to take was allocated to them anyway. That's not a scandal in the sense of somebody doing something wrong. Nobody stole that £94. It's a description of where risk goes when the party taking it has nothing to lose. Then there is Bulb, which was too large for that mechanism to handle. Bulb had around 1.6 million domestic customers and 12,000 business customers when it entered a special administration regime in November 2021. That's a process reserved for companies providing essential services, where a normal insolvency would be too disruptive, the same regime that hovers over the water industry today. The government ran it directly. It spent around £900 million doing so in one financial year and budgeted around another £1 billion for the next. The administration itself cost roughly £60 million in fees. The company was eventually sold, and estimates of the total cost ran into billions. Some described it as the most expensive rescue since the banks in 2008. One company, run by the state for the best part of a year, because it was too big to hand to a competitor and too essential to switch off. So what changed? Quite a lot, actually, and it's worth giving credit where it's due. Tighter financial requirements were introduced for new entrants from 2019, though not for existing suppliers until 2021, which is to say, the rules arrived for newcomers before they arrived for the companies already trading, and the crisis hit in the gap. Since then, suppliers have been required to build up capital, and across the sector net asset reserves of around £7.5 billion have accumulated. That is precisely the buffer that did not exist before. And in 2025 the regulator introduced a rule called the supplier of last resort levy offset. Under it, the rescuing supplier must first claim against the failed company's remaining assets through the insolvency process, before falling back on the levy. The regulator estimated that had this been in place during the crisis, around 60% of the amount paid out through the levy could have been recovered from the failed companies themselves. 60% of £2 and a bit billion. Recoverable, if anyone had thought to look at the estate first. Which tells you the previous arrangement wasn't a considered decision that consumers should bear the cost. It was simply the path of least resistance, applied at speed, during a crisis, and never revisited until afterwards. So what should you take from this? Not that competition in energy was a mistake. The Big Six era was genuinely poor for consumers, and the desire to break it was reasonable. What I'd take is narrower, and it is about what the word competition actually requires. A competitive market disciplines companies because bad decisions are punished. Take too much risk, misjudge the market, and you lose your money. That threat is what makes the discipline real, and it is why competition produces efficiency rather than just noise. But it only works if the person taking the risk is the person who bears the loss. Break that link, and you have not created competition. You have created a one-way bet, where the upside is private and the downside is distributed across people who were never asked. And the way that link gets broken is almost never dramatic. Nobody proposes it. It happens by lowering an entry requirement, for a good reason, in pursuit of a genuine benefit, without anybody calculating what the requirement was actually holding up. Capital requirements are boring. They are technical, they suppress competition by design, and removing them produces visible, immediate, popular results. Dozens of new suppliers, cheaper tariffs, better switching rates. The cost arrives years later, in a form nobody attributes to the original decision, spread across millions of bills at £94 a time. The graduate with the laptop was not the problem. The problem is that the system was built so that a graduate with a laptop could take on 1 million households worth of risk, without anybody asking what would happen if he was wrong.